In this example, we are going to see more difficult factorization, fractional equation. So we might be getting more than one answers. And in any case, right, you might need to check whether you will need to reject or not. Okay, so sometimes when you get more than one answer, you need to check whether you need to reject or not. Okay, so I will explain the rejection idea. Okay, so it will still be the same method, cross multiply, uh, or you need to make same denominator, then cross multiply. So if I look at 2a, it is a plain situation when it's just plain cross multiply. So when you do a cross multiply in this situation, you actually got a square. The bracket is the same. So you actually got a square. So that brings you back to your algebra expansion. So do your normal expansion. I hope by now the expansion is relatively easy for you. Okay, you should have no mistake in your expansion. And it leads you to a quadratic equation. And I also hope that by now you have no issue with the cross factorization. That means right from here, you can perform your method efficiently. And also, if you can already do it mentally. Okay, so that is where you come to this stage is your quadratic equation. So you go and do your first bracket equal to 0, second bracket equal to 0. So you will have gotten your two answers. So how will you check whether your answer is valid or not? So the checking has got to do with the denominator of the fraction. The denominator cannot be 0. So the denominator of fraction cannot be 0. So the denominator cannot be 0. Okay, so why denominator cannot be 0? So if you try on your calculator, okay, like 4 divided by 0, your calculator actually gave you a math error. So the logic of rejection will be whether your answer will make denominator 0 or not. So, okay, these two answers are both valid. How do you know? Okay, so how do you know? So the denominator in the question is x minus 5. So if you put in a 7, the denominator is 2. So that is an okay denominator. If you put in 3, the denominator is equal to 3 minus 5, which is a minus 2. As long as the denominator is not a 0, the two answers will be acceptable. So that's why these two answers are both acceptable. So in a way, right, denominator cannot be 0. So for this question, x minus 5 cannot be 0. So x cannot be a 5. You bring it over. So the not acceptable answer is 5. So if you happen to have one answer to be 5, then you need to reject it. Okay, but in this case, 7 and 3 are both acceptable because it doesn't make the denominator 0. Okay, so that's how you check. Okay, I try to illustrate more checking to show you. Okay, in the next question, it's also a direct cross multiplication. It's really a very direct one. So you just cross multiply. So there will be expansion on both sides of the equation. So please perform your expansion carefully. So by now your expansion should be very perfect. Okay, so you should be able to do your extension very well. Okay, so I got a quadratic equation. So be observant about the quadratic equation. You realize that the numbers can be divided by 3. So I will divide by 3 throughout. So it can facilitate my factorization. So here are my two answers. Here are my two answers. But if I'm going to do the checking, I got two denominator to check. So I need to check. So I got two denominator I need to check. So let's go to the logic of checking. So it doesn't matter that you got two denominator. In our fractional equation, you cannot afford the denominator to be zero. So the idea is denominator cannot be zero. Because when denominator is zero, if you punch calculator, it's a math error. So I'm going to check the first denominator. It cannot be zero. So x cannot be a -2. Okay. Then I'm going to check the second denominator. So when I do a checking like this, right, I realize that these are the two special value that will make the denominator zero. So the two answers that you've gotten doesn't match these two. So these two are acceptable values. Okay, so you do not need to show the checking. Mentally, you can check. Okay, try to do a mental check in this way. So all the checking that I'm doing here, right, you do not need to show. Okay, you can just even punch calculator to check. Okay, so okay, the more difficult one will be sometimes you need to factorize before making same denominator. Okay, sometimes you need to factorize before making same denominator. So in this part C, actually the one side here is a 0. So I could have chosen to bring it over. Okay, so we can also bring it over. Okay, but because I want to show you the idea about making same denominator through factorization, so I don't want to bring it over. So I'm going to factorize the denominator. The denominator is factorizable. And by now you should be you should be able to do mental already. You should be very sensitive to this factorization. So you factorize. And then you try to make same denominator. So you can compare the bracket. So there is a missing bracket. So again, you make same denominator. Once you got same denominator, you will get a single fraction. So it's actually very repetitive. Okay, so it's once you get the idea, you find it's so boring to keep doing this. Okay, because it's the same process. Make same denominator, then I cross multiply. But of course, sometimes you don't get the answer. It could be because there is really a lot of chance to make careless mistake. Okay. So once we can make into a single fraction, realize that there's a lot of simplification you can do before we cross multiply. Now, the cross multiplication, some people will have some chance of making careless mistake. When they multiply something by 0, by right, anything that you multiply by 0 is a 0. But some people, they will unknowingly tell me that x squared minus 9 times 0 is still x squared minus 9. So that is a common mistake. So by right, any expression or any values that you multiply by 0 will already disappear. So in this question, when you do the cross multiplication, it actually gave you a 0. It actually gave you a 0. And then it gave you a 5. So even though there's only one answer, if you would like to do the checking, you can. So mentally to me, right, I would just tell myself, okay, what will make this a 0? So 3 will make this a 0. So x cannot be 3. Okay, what will make this a 0? You can mentally think 3 square minus 9 will be a 0. Minus 3 square minus 9 will also be a 0. So all in all, from here, right, you can think it in this way. So back to the idea of denominator cannot be 0. So back to the idea that the denominator cannot be 0. So there are two denominator. This thing cannot be 0. So x cannot be 3. X squared minus 9 cannot be 0. That means x plus 3, x minus 3 cannot be 0. Meaning each of the bracket cannot be 0. So this is called the invalid answer. So the answer that's not valid is 3 and minus 3. So this is a 5. So 5 is good to go. Okay. So that's how you check whether what is the not valid answer. Okay, so for this one, okay, fraction plus fraction equal to a fraction. So same thing, try to make same denominator. Okay, so make same denominator. Because you're going to multiply the missing bracket. Okay, make same denominator. Okay, some of you are not doing it by this method, and sometimes you get inconsistency. Okay, I would suggest this is the standard method. So make same denominator, and then I will try to cross multiply. Okay, do you realize every time before I cross multiply, I actually try to do something to the fraction until there's nothing for me to do. Okay, so here I will expand. So hopefully your expansion is very mental already. So you can actually perform all this quite fast with accuracy. So then I go for my cross multiplication. So you just like, it's really like just keep expanding, make same denominator, then bring everything over to one side. And then when you get a quadratic, you factorize. Then first bracket equal to 0, second bracket equal to 0. So it's actually very repetitive. Make same denominator, cross multiply, and you get a quadratic. So to some of you, it's a lot of process. Yeah, it's a lot. That's why when you can do such a question, sometimes it's worth like 4 marks, 5 marks, 6 marks. Or I even saw 7 marks question before. So these are the two answers. Okay, so these two answers are valid. Okay, but you can do a check. You do a check with the mentality that denominator cannot be 0. So I got two denominator. So the first denominator cannot be 0. So x cannot be minus 1. The second denominator cannot be 0. So x cannot be 3. So as long as your answers are not these two, then it's going to be some valid answer. Okay, so as the fraction gets more complex, you will need to check whether it's acceptable or not. And the strategy is still make same denominator, cross multiply. In a more difficult situation will be factorize, then make same denominator, then cross multiply. So you draw a mind map for yourself. Factorize, make same denominator, cross multiply. No matter what, the method is not going to change. You stay with that method. The fraction will change, the question will change, but the method is going to stay all the way same until you do your upper set fractional equation.